Alright, so let's talk about JSON. So this is going to be an introduction to JSON and the JSON structure. So we'll first talk about the basic structure of a JSON object, then we'll talk about value types, then we'll talk about some basic nesting, then we'll talk about some deep nesting. So we'll go over each of those individually and then come back after each step. Alright, so let's go into our Mongo shell and let's use JSON intro. Alright, so first let's do db.basic.find. So this is a basic JSON object that I inserted earlier. Basically it has an underscore ID field and a name field. So from this you can get a pretty good sense of what the JSON format looks like. It's meant to be a human readable data format, but if you type something in JSON, any JSON parser can accept it. It's also generated by a lot of different projects. So the idea is that this whole thing is a JSON object. And the way you start a JSON object is you actually have the open curly brace, and inside the curly brace you actually have a bunch of key value pairs. So you have a key, then a colon, then the value, and then if you want to have another key value pair, you put a comma here, and then a key, colon, and another value. And then if your object is done, you use a close curly brace. So that's the basic structure of a JSON object. This is a document that I inserted with name MongoDB, and MongoDB actually automatically generated this underscore ID field, which is meant to be unique across the whole system. Alright, so this is the basic structure of a JSON object. Alright, so now we talked about a basic JSON structure. So next let's actually talk about the values in our JSON structure. You know, we'd mentioned the key value pairs. Let's talk about what the values can actually be. Alright, we're back in our Mongo shell in the JSON intro database, and let's just do db.values.find. And let's actually do db.values.find.pretty to make this a little bit easier to see. Alright, so these are two values that we have in our JSON intro database and our values collection. So you see we have two documents here, and we actually have a lot of different types for our values. So if you remember before, we had these key value pairs. We had the field name, and then the actual value, then a comma, field name colon value, comma, field name colon value, then close brace to end our object. So this is one JSON object, two JSON objects. So our collection actually has two documents in it right now, and you can tell because these curly braces actually delimit the beginning and end of each JSON object. So what I really wanted to point out here is that the values actually can have different types. So notice here we have name colon MongoDB. MongoDB is in quotes, which means it's a string type in our JSON object. Down here we have database colon true, so we actually have a Boolean type right here. Down here we have food colon pie in quotes, means that's a string type. Down here we have price colon 1099. You can see here that this is actually a numeric type. So the idea here is that we actually can have different types in our values. Not only can we have different types, we can actually have completely different fields, and we could have the same field with two different types. So down here, we could have database colon yes, if we wanted, or database colon no. Alright, so the idea here is that you can actually represent values with completely different types in a single JSON object. So we talked about value types in JSON, and some of the different ways you can represent that, but actually directly related to that is the idea of nesting. So not only can we have different types for our values, we can actually go beyond just the primitive types and actually have more complicated structures. So let's look at an example of that. Alright, so now we're back in our Mongo shell. We're going to look at some examples of nested JSON structures. So let's just do a query here, db.nested.find, then do .pretty to make it easier to read. So here we have two examples of nested JSON structures. So notice like before, we have our key value pairs, ID colon, object ID, product colon, car. We have our string type, cars in quotes. But colors actually is an array here. So if you open with a square bracket in JSON, that indicates that you're starting an array, and that actually has a slightly different syntax. So in our array, we can have just value, comma, value. So we don't have keys in our array, it's kind of implicit. So you can think of the key for red as being 0, the key for this value, black, as 1. So down here we have another example of a nested structure. We have our product key, and we have the value of laptop, that's a string. Then we have our attributes, which is actually a nested object. So since we're opening with a curly brace, we actually are indicating that the value of attributes is an object itself, which itself has key value pairs. So down here we have type max, shiny true, expensive true, and that's all in the attribute subdocument or subobject. Alright, so that's an example of using nested structures in JSON. Alright, so we talked a little bit about basic nesting in JSON. So now let's talk about some more complicated structures and really get into what we can do with these nested JSON structures. So back in our shell, I'm going to do a query on the deep nested collection and pretty print it so it makes it easier to read. So this document's a little bit more complicated, so I just have one in here. This is an example of a more complex nested structure and kind of should give you an idea of the variety of things that we can represent using these nested structures. So just like before, we have our key value pairs, class : algebra, and students : and again, just like before, we had an array. But notice inside our array, we don't have just string values or booleans. We actually have an object. So this shows that the values of our array are just like values in an object. They can actually have any type, including objects or arrays. So this could be an array of arrays, this could be an array of objects, this could be an array of objects, strings, and booleans all mixed together. This is just showing our nested structure. So here we have our array. In it is this object. And we have keys and values in this object, name : Susan, activities : and then this array. And in this array, we also have objects. We have objects for the activities, and they give more description of what the activities are than simple strings. So we could actually have activities just be an array of strings, but this is just to show that we can represent even more than that. So we have an array, and inside that we have an object. Inside that we have an object or one of the values is an array, which itself contains objects. So this is an example of representing a deeply nested structure in JSON. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use these JSON objects in the shell in case you want to experiment with this on your own. So just to get started, let's get this document out of our deep nested collection and assign it to the course variable. Let's print this out, see what it looks like. Alright, so we see our same nested structure that we just found in our deep nested collection. So what we can do here is we can actually access this just like a normal JavaScript object. So we can actually do course.students, and we see our array of students. We can also use bracket notation. We get the same result. So we can access this just like we would a normal JavaScript object, and actually what we can do is go deep into the structure of this document. So we can actually do course students and get the first student in the students array, and then do dot name. So we've actually gone deep into this document, and I'll actually print that out again. So we've actually gone deep into this document and said we're getting this course document, looking at the students array, looking at the first element of the array with this 0 index, and then just doing dot name to get the name out of the document in the first element of the array. So not only can we read these elements and see them as JSON, we can actually modify them. So let's say Susan wanted to be called Sue. We could just change the name, and now if we print out our students object, we can see down here Susan has been replaced by Sue in the name field of this first student document. So as a final note, if you want to get more information about JSON, what JSON really is, and what qualifies as valid JSON, you can actually go to json.org and actually see the complete JSON specification. Alright, so now it's time for a quiz. Which of the following are valid JSON documents? So check all of these that are valid JSON documents.